Okay. And so during the Cold War, what happens is, these countries never go directly to war against each other, but you have many places around the world that are former colonies that are getting their independence, um, you know, around this time period, right after World War II. And both the USSR and the US are kind of trying to influence these countries to, choose their way of doing things. So the US sees itself as, look, we are, the bastion of freedom. We got democracy, we have all these rights, we have a free economy. You can, if you want to produce, you can produce. If you want to ever want to, if you want to consume, you want to consume. So we are this bastion of, freedom, democracy, um, you know, economic mobility, economic success. Whereas the Soviet Union similarly sees itself as this force of good. Like, hey, we are, empowering the workers. We have our origin in this, these worker revolutions. We are, essentially empowering the workers of the world against these imperialist capitalistic forces. And so they both really have these, high ideals, but in many ways they're subverting them. Essentially they're in the end, when it comes down to a choice between, some authoritarian that supports the U.S. or an authoritarian that supports the USSR, the U.S. goes with the authoritarian. Or sorry, actually, you can even say a democratically elected leader who would be sympathetic to the USSR. The U.S. will choose, the dictator. Basically, it's they will choose anybody who is in opposition to the USSR. That is their primary goal, not necessarily these high-minded ideals. And this, this pattern continues post-war. So you see this in kind of the nation building the U.S. engages in Afghanistan, post 9/11, where it's, we're just essentially, we are supporting whatever regime. We're trying to support democracy. That would be the best. But whatever regime is, against the Taliban, that's what we want. And oftentimes, oftentimes there's not necessarily a good alternative. Although we do see those democratic alternatives that the U.S. opts for a dictator instead. In some instances in the Cold War. Okay. In terms of capitalism, there are post-war successes, and again, the U.S. is going to try to destabilize any country that has a economic system antithetical to capitalism. We're not, or is leaning socialist, because therefore, if you lean socialist, you will be sympathetic to the Soviets. So we're going to kind of go through um, all these little episodes, post-war successes, the CIA, the covert interventions. We'll talk a little bit about Vietnam, since it is this huge kind of touch point of the Cold War. But we'll primarily look at it through the lens of hard power versus soft power. And then we'll talk about, finally, we'll end with the end of the Cold War and the Washington Consensus. Okay. All right. So let's look at the post war, right after war. So, right after World War II, essentially Western Europe is decimated. So, these countries are reduced in many ways to rubble because of the war, because of the bombings. The U.S. is largely spared because of because of the oceans. Because thank you, Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Um, but your Western European countries, many of their cities are rubble, and Japan as well. So Japan is, most of its lost many of its cities, or it's lost, large parts of its cities. And so there is this effort, um, by uh, by the U.S. and its allies to kind of rebuild Western Europe. And some of the ideas, let's rebuild this place, that was hurt by war, and some of it, let's rebuild this place so the populace doesn't turn to communism and then to the Soviet Union. And this is, largely successful. So the Marshall Plan is seen as a historic success. And you actually see it invoked even up into the present. We need a Marshall Plan for this. We need a Marshall Plan for that, because it is seen as such a success. I mean, similar to the New Deal, which is viewed as viewed from a historic lens as a success. Okay, and so here we have the spending. Okay, this is relative aid. And so you can see a lot of it. This is West Germany here. Italy, France, and the UK, or this is Britain, I guess. I guess no, this would be the UK because it's including Northern Ireland. Okay, and so you can see kind of the spending. And part of this is done to stem that tide of communism that is spread throughout Eastern Europe. Kind of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence has spread to here, and this aid is kind of designed to stop that, kind of rebuild these countries so they can um, remain as they were before the war as capitalist democratic countries. The Japanese occupation is super interesting, and we're just going to kind of cover it in brief, but it is a very interesting episode. And so the occupying forces led by MacArthur, the U.S. occupying forces after Japan, after World War II. So Japan surrenders to the U.S. and then the U.S. occupies Japan, and they decide to keep most of the existing institutions. So they keep the emperor in place. They say, "All right, we're going to keep." It's like a king, It's like if okay, we're going to keep the monarchy in place. They keep the parliament, which is called the Diet, I guess. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce. Even though I live in Japan, I don't know how to pronounce it. Although they do reform it, and they kind of keep most of the parts of the Japanese government. It was primarily the military that was in charge, so it's not necessarily crazy to keep, the democratic parts of the Japanese government. They liberalize the economy. They impose freedom of speech and freedom of religion. They allow trade unions, and they reform the labor standards. Essentially, they bring the labor standards more in line with what they are in the Western world. And then the occupation ends in 52. So basically, they keep these existing institutions and they kind of just modify the economy. And there's like it's not all peaches. Like there were atrocities committed by U.S. troops in this period. And there's also it's not to paint with a broad brush. There are some U.S. troops that are not committing atrocities, that are friendly and revered. I mean, my grandpa was part of the occupation, and he used to take the local kids sailing. So, um, yeah, I mean, that's what he did. I mean, the other guys were not as nice. That's what he told me. All right, enough about personal history. So let's talk about kind of one of the big things that happened, which are land reforms. And so Japan modernizes in the mid 19th century with the Meiji Restoration. Again, another fascinating period of history, if you're interested. And essentially, what happens is at this time period, it's like a feudal system, and they recognize they need to adjust their system, adjust their economy in order to keep pace with the West, in order to not become to not get colonized. And so they need to really, really reform their economy. And so what they do is they expropriate land from the local daimyos, who are kind of the local feudal lords. And in exchange for taking their land, they give them political power, and they redistribute the land to the peasants, to the peasant farmers. Okay, and rice production doubles. Essentially, this is a privatization. They essentially give the farmers private property, and every time you do that, you will see increased crop yields, at least through history. And so that's what happens. Now, some of the land had been consolidated by the time World War II happened. So there's reconsolidation of the land. So after World War II, the U.S. essentially decides we are going to redo this. We want to redistribute more of the land. We want to give this land back to the peasant farmers. And so they essentially do this all over again. They expropriate land and give it to the peasant farmers to kind of create this broad base. This is kind of like a Jeffersonian idea of having, lots of local land owners, like lots of small scale landowners, to give people a stake in their country, to give people a stake in democracy. And so this is the idea of a economic advisor, Wolf Legensky. There he is, right there, who essentially is like, hey, we need to do all this land reform to give these peasants a seat at the table, to make them invested in democracy, to make capitalism work in these places. We really need to do this land reform, and they do it. They do this in Japan, and one of the reasons it works is, the problem when you're doing a land reform is the people whose land gets taken away are usually not happy about it. So you can just straight up expropriate it. You can take it away and give it to the peasants. You can compensate them, so you can give them some money, but typically they're never compensated at market value. You're never given full, full value of your land when you do when countries do these land reforms. And so you have a whole class of landowners that are very mad after a land reform. And oftentimes this can be politically destabilizing. This group can come back and kind of take their revenge. They typically tend to be powerful people. And so what one of the reasons why the Japanese land reform works is the US is the bad guy. So the people whose land is expropriated, they don't blame the peasants. They don't blame other Japanese. They blame the U.S. And so they can't really take their revenge on the U.S. And so they essentially are forced to accept this land reform. And they don't get there's not sort of political repercussions down the line as we'll see in Chile later. All right, and so again, this is just an unknown figure in U.S. history, but he essentially, spearheads this land redistribution, and then ones we'll see later in South Korea and Taiwan are based on this. Okay, and so this is a overall, the Japanese recovery from World War II is a rousing success, and one of the ways we can see this is in the height data. So height is a proxy for development. So the more food that you have when you're in utero and when you are young, the taller you will be. You can think of somebody's height as being, part a product of their environment and part a product of genetics. But that environmental part is very much based on nutrition in utero and when you're young. And so you can look at heights when you absent economic data, which we don't have good economic data from some of these periods. Economic historians will use height as a proxy for GDP or economic development. And so, this is maybe the starkest way to look at the Japanese recovery is you can see, these sort of bad periods here. So this is by birth year, I believe. Oh no, sorry. Average height is 17-year-old males. So you can see these bad periods here, but the general trend is towards recovery. This has got to be by birth year, doesn't it? Yeah, this has got to be by birth year. So because these are the hard years. The hard years are right after the war. Okay. Anyways, so the overall trend shows this recovery. As Japan's economy recovers and actually even prospers, it becomes richer than it was before the war. To the point where it's one of the most developed countries in the world. It had a bad 1990s, but besides that lost decade, generally been a successful country. Okay, and so just to recap this little section, essentially the interventions of the U.S. overall, worked in terms of later economic growth. Western Europe recovered, Japan recovered from World War II. These are not all to do with the U.S., but it's hard to make the argument that the land reforms and the occupation hindered growth in Japan, or the Marshall Aid hindered growth in Western Europe. Maybe they're not wholly responsible. Obviously, everything is complex. Nothing is monocausal. So there's a number of factors leading to Western Europe's recovery and Japan's development post-war. But the U.S. Most likely did not hinder that growth. And also, you can see some of this aid is going to the Axis powers here, Western Europe and Italy. And Western Europe in particular also becomes an economic powerhouse in the back half of the 20th century. Okay, we will take a break. Oh, actually, sorry. One more thing to mention. One more thing to think about the Marshall Plan. A good analogy with both these places, with both Japan and Germany. And just thinking about why this might not work in other places. So essentially, both these places are benefit with, essentially large economic aid packages. Why might not this work in a developing country? The way you want to think about this is, say Apple's, the company Apple, okay? if Apple's headquarters was destroyed, um, would Apple come back? Would Apple be able to rebuild itself as a great company? Yeah, most likely. They just lost their headquarters. They can rebuild that. That's something that you can start over. Similar thing happening here. The infrastructure is destroyed, but the skills, the talents, the institutions are not necessarily destroyed. And so you just rebuild infrastructure, and the people have the skills and the ability to bring it back. Same way you destroy Apple's headquarters, well, the programmers, the engineers, they still have the skills and talent to make Apple what Apple is. If you just build Apple's headquarters in the middle of like a wheat field in Kansas or something, you would not expect a innovative company to spring up there just if they had the headquarters. So similarly, if you just build infrastructure without also developing those other things, the skills, the talents, the educational institutions of an area, you should not expect to have economic growth. Okay, all right, let's take a break.